Millar. I dive at Kingston and Elmbridge, BSAC, and what I really want to talk about today. I know it was called Identifying Motor Torpedo Boats, and it was originally part of this was originally called Dark, Gay, or Nasty, which are just 3 kinds of motor torpedo boats. I don't make this stuff up, and this really came about because, as part of an expedition to identify a motor torpedo boat during the lockdown, I kind of fell down a bit of a rabbit hole in sort of researching motor torpedo boats. It became a bit of an obsession, and I'm so totally obsessed by these kind of absolutely bonkers pieces of machinery, and I'd like you to be as obsessed as I am. Why dive motor torpedo boats? Well, a lot of the big wrecks, have been found, but there's still a lot of fascinating things to be discovered. There's a lot of untold stories, and what I'd like you to do is to, sort of really, sort of take away from this some, sort of inspiration to maybe go and look for these things, and also know what they are if you happen to bump into one on a drift dive. So what I'm going to be talking about in true BSAC fashion, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to be talking about, but this is kind of roughly what we're speaking. I know the talk was called Identifying Motor Torpedo Boats. That's going to be a bit of it, but I'm going to be talking about the history of motor torpedo boats, what they are, why they happened, and a bit of a rant about why they are rubbish. Well, really a sort of technological dead end that everybody kept on sort of pushing because everybody thought that it was a good idea, in spite of all evidence otherwise. I'm going to sort of nerd out on their construction, because that's what we're interested in when we're diving, is kind of what's left, and I'm going to combine that with some tales of diving, MTBs, and kind of give you some thoughts about what your own adventures could look like. So yeah, these are little boats with big stories. They are stories of the extremes of technology, sort of people pushing what you can do with a planing hull, what you can do with extreme lightness, what you can do also with absolutely minimal materials in the extremes of war, and the bravery of the people who actually both actually brewed these things, and also the people who designed them, the sort of the way they sort of push technologies. And there are loads of these things still missing all over the world, from Hong Kong to Crete to the North Sea and the Channel. There are a load of these things down there. And sometimes we kind of think that there's nothing new to discover anymore. Actually, there is a lot, and just because these things are physically small doesn't mean that they're insignificant, or that they're sort of not worth diving. I think sometimes there's a lot of cynicism about things that aren't 100-meter long lumps of rust, but the stories can be just as fascinating. Motor torpedo boats. Let's just talk a little bit about their history. So once upon a time, there was this guy called Admiral Jackie Fisher, and he was one of the most influential people in the who's ever been in the Royal Navy. He was in the Royal Navy. He was running it right until his 80s. He kept on retiring. There's a great story that Churchill came into his office on the first day of sort of being put in charge of the Navy, and said, right, get me Jackie Fisher. Somebody said, Mr. Churchill, he's been retired for 2 years, and Churchill said, oh, Fisher's always bloody retiring, get him in here this afternoon. And Fisher's doctrine can really be described like this. He created dreadnoughts. I mean, sort of conceptually, just bear with me. His vision was dreadnoughts and heavy cruisers, really, really huge gun platforms that were really indomitable, very heavily armored, just sort of the most extreme expressions of power and technology. There were several countries that then started to try and match them, notably Germany, Admiral Tirpitz, who famously declared that if Germany built dreadnoughts, then there would be no chance that Britain and Germany would ever go to war, because that would be insane for 2 countries with dreadnoughts to go to war. Not sure how that really worked out, but when you think about it, it's this, exactly the same doctrine of nuclear weapons. So kind of Yeah, sometimes works, sometimes isn't. In France, and all you have to do is Google French pre-dreadnought to realize that the French were kind of making some quite whacked out steampunk technologies and maybe weren't up to keeping up with dreadnoughts. A sort of different mentality started to develop among young officers, which was fundamentally, again, conceptually this, which is build something which is very small, very light, has the latest sort of propulsion technology built into a much smaller space, which can get under the defenses of the sort of dreadnought Death Star and blow it up, which is this kind of like, really attractive idea, A, because it's really cheap, B, because there's something very sort of romantic about it that kind of appeals to us on just a kind of, David versus Goliath level, not to scale again. But in reality, the Death Star wins. And this is really the story of motor torpedo boats, is they always seem like this amazing idea that you could have these little things that are really fast, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and it just doesn't work out. But that doesn't stop navies building them in great quantities, but that also gives us a lot of wrecks to dive. So some history in the 19th century, in the sort of 1860s, if you were a wealthy person, or man with a sort of lot of money, unfortunately the Ferrari was not invented. So this was the thing that you went and got. It was a steam launch, and you could whiz up and down the Thames on this, and everybody would look at you and sort of think how cool you were. If you were the sort of person who looked at somebody in a Ferrari and thinks, oh, they look cool. And the finest of all the steamships were built at Chiswick by this guy. He looked exactly like this, John I. Thornycroft. Not to be confused with John Thornycroft, who was another guy who made early motors. But Thornycroft is busy building these rich phallic symbols, and along come he starts to get these calls from officers, not just from the French Navy as these guys were, as you can see, but from sort of various foreign navies. And what they want is for him to create a version of his motor launch, really, really fast, big engines, probably a bit less glass, and to put on it another great British invention, the Whitehead Torpedo. Torpedo, another fantastic British invention, and rather like a lot of British inventions like jet engines and football, we sort of invent them, then other people go away and make them better than us and kind of humiliate us with them. Torpedo, no exception. They have this idea, which is you're going to combine this amazing sort of steam launch technology with torpedoes. And Thornycroft kind of thinks about this and says, so France, a kind of historical enemy of Britain, wants us to build something that kills dreadnought battleships, kind of like British battleships. And the French go, yes. And he says, well, I'll have you know that I'm a Victorian British gentleman. And the French say, what does that mean? He goes, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And so so Thornycroft starts to build these. This is actually one he does actually build for the Admiralty. But the Admiralty are very skeptical about them, possibly because he's kind of saying that these things make their dreadnoughts obsolete, which doesn't go down very well. So he's kind of going to them and saying, we want to build these, and the British Navy he does build some for them, but it doesn't really go anywhere. But he starts building them for a ton of other nationalities, and then after a while, a decade or so passes, and Thornycroft comes back and says, hey, I'm building these for a whole load of navies, and a whole load of other navies are now building them for themselves. And the British Admiralty say, yeah, mate, we noticed. Thanks for building dreadnought killers for all these countries. And he say, I've got a proposition for you. And they're just going like, jog on, mate. We're not interested in motor torpedo boats. And he goes, no, hear me out. What about a motor torpedo boat? Destroyer. And the British Navy are like, right, so you have created a problem, and now you're going to sell us the solution to the problem that you created. And Thornycroft goes, late Victorian laissez-faire capitalism is wild. And so the British then invest in this, and I have suddenly forgotten what this destroyer is called, but it had some really cool name. But they built a a class of what were originally called motor torpedo boat destroyers, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So, you know, they end up being called destroyers. And this really kicks off an arms race in these, not to scale. But what you start to get is navies building torpedo boats and motor torpedo boat destroyers, and you know, each generation of them gets more and more formidable. And in fact, there's quite a sort of blur in the end between them, between, you know, destroyers have, you know, torpedo tubes on them, and what a torpedo boat is and what a torpedo boat destroyer is, you know, sort of becomes a bit grey around the edges. But ultimately, you know, this escalation happens everywhere. In Germany, they're called Schnellboot, fast boats, not very imaginative. The British call them E-boats. E stands for enemy, which is even less imaginative, really. But the Germans build loads of them, again, not necessarily because they're really into the doctrine, but because the Treaty of Versailles says you're not allowed to make really big battleships. And so the Germans go, okay, if we just make a lot of launches, just innocent launches, quite fast, but not armed. And they just happen to make the decks just big enough so you can get torpedo tubes onto them. And then, you know, once they decide to break this Treaty of Versailles, they go, oh, by coincidence, we put the torpedo tubes on, it fits very nicely here. Oh, what a coincidence. And if you think that that's kind of a rare thing, then you should Google what Japan's new battleship looks like, or maybe it's a cruiser or something, but it's they're not allowed to have aircraft carriers. So they've just built a battleship with a lot of tennis courts on it. So yeah, so this kind of bending of rules is kind of going on in Germany, which means that they start the war with an absolute shed load of motor torpedo boats. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. So let's talk first of all about some of motor torpedo boats' kind of early greatest hits. Perhaps an unfortunate turn of phrase. It's not the first victim, but maybe the first really big prominent victim is in I think 1905. So Russia and Japan declare war on each other, and the Kaiser says to the admirals of the Russian fleet, go and attack Japan. And the admirals of the Russian fleet say, you know, fleet is in St. Petersburg. Japan is on the other side of the world. We have no allies. Where do we refuel? Where do we get supplies? And the Tsar says, do not bring me problems, bring me solutions. So the Russian fleet steams all the way through the Baltic, round Cape of Good Horn, all the way around. Cape of Good Hope, all the way around to the straits at Tsushima, which are the sort of straits into the Sea of Japan, I think, and they go all the way around without stopping. You know, no time to kind of realize that you forgot toothpaste or something like that. And they get all the way to these straits, and they go straight into a big fog bank. And in that fog bank, they start signaling to each other, sort of try and keep close. And the Japanese fleet is also in the same fog bank, and the Japanese start going, oh wow, we're being signaled to in Russian. Holy crap. And they open fire. In this, as a torpedo boat sinks the pre-dreadnought Nyat-Suvorov. It goes down with all hands. Almost 1,000 men, you know, die. It goes into the water firing with all guns. A naval historian said, "While she had a gun above water, she fired, and not a man survived her of all that crew. To stubborn gallantry, no words can do justice. If there is immortality in naval memory, it is hers and theirs." You know, so the first really big Goliath to go down. Then we have to talk about in the First World War the Battle of Jutland. So in Jutland you have you know, in the left corner Admiral Jellicoe with kind of a painting where he has huge hands, and for some reason, and on the right Admiral Scheer. The two fleets kind of bump into each other in the North Sea. It's kind of awkward. They both see the same Danish ship, think it's an enemy ship, converge on it, and presumably there's some Danish bloke in the middle going like, holy crap. And by the time they see, you know, realize what's happened, they're engaged. And you know, after they both take a really, you know, sort of terrible thumping, and there's terrible casualties on both sides. The Jellicoe, or rather Scheer, calls off the German fleet. He sort of decides to withdraw, and as he withdraws, he sends out a load of torpedo boats, many as 50 torpedo boats, to cover his retreat. Jellicoe, who is pursuing, sees a torpedo boats fire torpedoes, and calls off the pursuit. Turns the ships around, saying, "Okay, enough. We're gonna no more losses today." And this sets off this huge controversy, because the torpedoes that are fired by these ships do almost no damage to the fleet, and there is then this vast controversy that goes on about whether Jellicoe did the right thing, because it's a bit like today if the American Navy was defeated by the or was sort of had a draw, if you like, with the Chinese Navy. That would be a massive defeat for America. And similarly here, this is a massive defeat for Britain, which is supposed to be the preeminent sea power. That it doesn't completely pulverize another nation's navy is just kind of deemed not acceptable. And so there's this controversy that goes on about whether Jellicoe was right. Are these motor torpedo boats just garbage, and sort of he should have carried on, or was he doing the right thing, saving sort of British blood and treasure by calling it off? I'm quite happy to be sort of Team Jellicoe in this one. Oh yeah, okay. And we should also talk about the amazing Commander Augustus Agar, who took this boat, a motor torpedo boat, but called Coastal Motorboat, which so during the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks take over. If you've ever seen the film Battleship Potemkin, the sailors revolt. It's actually that sort of kicks off a lot of the revolution. Sailors take control. Bolsheviks take control of a lot of the Russian naval ships. And Commander Augustus Agar was ordered to take his coastal motorboat, cruise into a Russian coastline, and pick up an agent who had been spying on the Bolsheviks, a guy who was brilliantly known as the man with 100 faces. Agar, on his way in, or possibly on his way out, I'm not sure, but torpedoed the cruiser Oleg, damaged two pre-dreadnoughts, and also sank a sort of refueling, resupplying ship as well. He didn't actually manage to pick up the agent, who had to walk all the way to France to escape Russia. So it's kind of like those video games where you kind of don't like kill the boss, but you get loads of points for doing all the sort of side quests. Agar did all the side quests and got enough points to get a Victoria Cross. So again, we're kind of seeing this maybe a sort of pattern here with the Japanese and Agar, in that motor torpedo boats are fantastic when you have the complete element of surprise. The element of surprise working for Agar was, of course, that the Russians didn't think we were at war with them, which is kind of helpful. And here's another coastal motorboat, and this one in 1919, and this is something else that is a kind of theme throughout motor torpedo boats, which is really fascinating, is the role of women in sort of almost every aspect of their development. So women, Wrens here, sort of serviced motor torpedo boats in the Second World War, certainly in Britain and the US and Canada. They built motor torpedo boats. Again in World War II, serviced them, and kind of really interestingly sank them. Wrens, and I got this off a page about there were these women who spoke German and were called headache operators, and they operated at remote coastal listening stations, listening to German E-boats. And apparently the German E-boat commanders were really, really bad at radio discipline, and they would just chat all the time about, literally kind of like, "Are you going for a beer later?" It's like, "Yeah, fine." And this would all just be written down, and the stuff that was in plain German would be translated and sent to destroyers protecting the coastal convoys. and the stuff that was encoded was sent to Bletchley Park. I took this photograph off a page about headache officers, but every time I look at it, I think, is that Queen Elizabeth? And of course, you know, maybe she does speak German. I don't know. Her husband does. So maybe it is. There's some kind of secret thing that we don't know about. But most fascinatingly of all, about the role of women is this woman, who is Blanche Thornycroft, granddaughter of John I. Thornycroft. And she began helping her dad with the test tank model. So the first test tank they had was a duck pond with a wave machine in it, kind of like the ones in Centre Parks, only marginally less expensive. And but you know, the sort of don't know what the ducks thought of this, but they would then sort of test the holes on it, and then they built a full-size test tank on the actually on the grounds of their house in the Isle of Wight, which is pretty cool. But Blanche Thornycroft went from running the tank to actually building the hulls and designing the planing hulls. By the time she died in 1950, she was acknowledged as one of the world's great authorities on planing hull design. And before you just think, oh, it's just nepotism, and you know, with her family, you know, sort of owned Thornycroft. She had 5 brothers, and none of them were allowed near the engineering. She was the only one who became an engineer. Motor torpedo boat design in Britain in the 1930s can really be seen as a duel between these two people. So on the left, you have Blanche Thornycroft, here with a really early kind of steampunk 1930s data disc, which is quite cool. And on the right, Peter Duquesne. So Duquesne was one of the sort of founder or certainly a director and sort of designer at Supermarine, who later made the Spitfire. He hired Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, but he left Supermarine and he went to a company called Vosper's, and Vosper's made, you know, a lot of sort of, you know, speedboats, you know, especially in the 1930s, were making a lot of, you know, sort of future world record breaking speedboats. One of Bluebird's, not the one that killed Donald Campbell, but also is it Crusader, which is the one I think they found the wreck recently in Loch Ness, which did crash. Really, this could be seen as this kind of battle royale between these two people, both of whom are designing motor torpedo boats. Many countries around the world trying to persuade the Royal Navy to buy into motor torpedo boats, and the Royal Navy still telling them to get on their bikes. And these are the kind of two designs that both these companies actually make these designs. They make prototypes of them to demonstrate to the Royal Navy. They also start selling them to, you know, sort of various other navies, including Italy. So this is Thornycroft's, and the Thornycroft sort of doctrine is that the torpedoes, and I will actually annotate this so you can see that Thornycroft's have the torpedoes are fired at the stern, and they're sort of in these troughs. So again, people think of motor torpedo boats as having you know, torpedo tubes on them, but the Thornycrofts don't. The idea of these things is you actually idle up close to your target, using your auxiliary engine, so a smaller, maybe a sort of V8 engine, something like that, which will only do about 5 or 6 knots. You then turn to face away from your enemy, fire your torpedoes over the stern, start up your main engines, and anybody who's ever started up an outboard at sea knows it can be quite a sweaty moment. You know, trying to start a couple of you know, sort of massive aircraft engine inside a wooden hull, while you're waiting for a torpedo to, you know, hit or at least startle some very heavily armed target is going to be, you know, kind of quite a sort of pucker inducing. These early ones, some of them have Stirling engines, some of them have, and some of the actually best engines of World War II, which are called, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but Isotta Fraschini engines, which are Italian. So, you know, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but good luck getting the parts for those. These were later replaced by Packards, and I'm going to talk a lot more about Packards, and were designed by Blanche Thornycroft. These were up against the Vosper. The Vosper is, you know, it's kind of less elegant kind of design. It's a little bit more kind of, you know, like I design drew a bow kind of thing. But the things that you can see that are sort of different instantly is, it's got this much kind of squarer stern, and it's got a torpedo tube here. Now these come in different flavors. There's kind of early ones 2 torpedo tubes, later in the war they get 4. There's also the idea was always that they would have 21-inch torpedo tubes, but due to shortages, sometimes those went down to 18-inch, which were actually more designed for, I think, aircraft and stuff like that. 18-inch torpedoes, but were sort of smaller, lighter, packed less of a punch. And again, is designed by Peter Duquesne. And the thing about this is that Vospers win out. So one of the things that happens is there are Thornycrofts around, but the vast majority of motor torpedo boats are variants of this, and it's about 72 feet long. There's again variants that are 70, 73, 74, but this is by far the most numerous kind of torpedo boat, indeed, in variants like motor gun boats and mine layers and things like that, of World War II. Other kinds, I'm going to talk a bit about these, but so these are PT boats. These are made by Elko. Elko is a US manufacturer, also designed by Peter Duquesne. So Peter Duquesne also kind of flounced out of Vosper at some stage, and went to America, joined up with some manufacturers there, and started making this again. Quite a distinctive shape. So some of the things you can see on an Elko, it has this sort of what's called whale back sort of a shape. A lot of them, they came with these perspex coverings over the machine guns, which are more comfortable. These ships were made to be much more comfortable. US sailors were much more demanding of comforts, and one of the brilliant things, if anybody who's watching is from the Royal Navy, this might make you smile. The Navy, when they got these new ships and they had these really fancy kitchens and fridges and really nice bunks, ripped all of that stuff out. The idea being that if the British sailors who were on these new American boats would they would have an absolute fit, and there was no way that they were going to retrofit fridges and stuff like that into the Vospers. So although these things came very highly spec'd, that didn't last very long. And I'm going to talk more about the different sorts of sort of construction of those things. There's a whole lot more kinds of torpedo boat that I'm not really going to dwell on too much. So British Powerboat also makes something that looks a bit Elko-ish like. There are much bigger ones. So the Fairmile is really the British start to look at the German E-boats. The German E-boats have diesel engines, which have the fantastic advantage that they don't blow up because they don't run on very, very volatile fuel. They're also just bigger, more heavily armed, and Fairmile make a lot of these. They've got a slightly different kind of construction. They also there were stripped down versions, so they use them as blockade runners. So going to places like Sweden to get vital parts, like ball bearings. So there are stripped down versions of these things that are just almost completely empty, just engine. And the speeds that these things do are insane, sort of getting close to 60 knots. And the Denny steam gun boat, which I think is my favorite, which actually has a experimental steam turbine engine in it, and again could reach 60 knots, which if you've ever been in a rib that's doing 30 knots, just imagine what 60 knots in something not that much bigger must have been like. Post-war, so again, Britain realizes, and I'm going to talk quite a lot more about this, but the aero engines in boats is just a really, really bad idea. They they're just so explosive. The fuel is so explosive. It's one thing that's more explosive than aircraft fuel. It's the fumes from aircraft fuel. So they commission diesel engines, these very, very powerful engines. And these engines called Deltic engines. Again, I'll talk a bit more about that. But Deltics become a sort of incredible workhorse of British industry all over the Navy uses them as sort of giant compressors and stuff like that. The Deltic is an incredibly successful engine, but there's a sort of stopgap as well because the Deltic's development is delayed. So they build this class called called the Gay class, and which is kind of one of those names that has kind of gone through sort of being sort of completely acceptable in the 50s to being quite, sort of like eyebrow raising to actually being really cool. That you've got these guys. I think there's one that was actually skippered by Dennis Healy for a while, which is called Gay Gladiator, and there's Gay Charioteer and stuff like that. So kind of super evocative and quite cool names. And these were also powered by even bigger V12 Packard engines, just because the diesels weren't yet available. They also had this design flaw, which is they had so much fuel in them when they were full that they went like that and wouldn't go on the plane. You've probably been in a dive boat like that where people are trying to get all the cylinders onto the bow to try and get it down to get it up on the plane. So they talk a bit more about that, but they had to build these kind of flaps on the back to help them get up on the plane. It's nice to see that, all this kind of like, presumably the equivalent today of tens of millions of pounds worth of design, and then somebody has to bodge a load of stuff on the back with a scaffold pole. So the pros of motor torpedo boats. They are versatile platforms, and this on the right is a great example of that. This is from the Eagle comic. There's a great cutaway sort of feature on Dark class. So you can see at the top it's a motor torpedo boat, and then there's more of a sort of combined torpedo boat gunboat with only 2 tubes. The one on the top has 4 tubes, and then one which is a mine layer at the bottom. So the same platform. Again, if you discover one of these in the water, and it has a certain kind of construction that I'll talk about, and the engines, you don't necessarily know that you found a motor torpedo boat. You know that you might have found something which could be an RAF launch. It could be the same hulls were used for harbour defence craft, for example. So there's a sort of vast range of stuff that these things were used for. Also, during the war, they were constantly upgrading them, or indeed in some cases, like going from 21-inch to 18-inch torpedo tube, kind of downgrading them. So they're a bit like Formula One cars. They were sort of coming into the pits. People were ripping engines out, putting new engines in. They're very, very modular. But this also, makes it challenging to identify them, because just because you found a plate on something, it's not necessarily traceable back to a particular boat, because this stuff was just being chopped and changed all the time. Armaments were constantly being upgraded. Boats, stuff like that. One of the things that these things are brilliant for is special forces expeditions. So things like the assault on Saint-Nazaire, where the main objective of Saint-Nazaire was to blow up the lock gates. The dry dock, which was successful. There was a motor torpedo boat which also fired torpedoes at a secondary gate and also destroyed that. I mean, the tragedy at Saint-Nazaire was that there were a lot of commandos. The idea, it was at the time sort of given a name which is sort of a sort of distracting raid or something. In fact, it seems that what they were doing was trying to get a 4-rig rotor Enigma machine. And they came up in a load of motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, which had extra fuel tanks on the side of them for the return journey. And unfortunately, the Germans were able to turn their anti-aircraft guns, get them low enough to be able to fire at these. And the tracer bullets ignited the fumes in the fuel tanks, and the accounts of the people perishing in the flames and in the water that was on fire is, even if you're divers, you read a lot of accounts of wrecks, and this is particularly horrible and harrowing. These were crazy bits of technology that didn't really work, and the people who were in them had this kind of, it's a kind of Child of the Light Brigade kind of courage of people in, inappropriate technology doing things that they shouldn't be doing in them. And it's kind of pretty mind-boggling that what they actually did. One of the things that was often much more successful was landing of SOE agents and commandos, things like that, for pinprick raids up and down the coast right through the Mediterranean. and in Northern Europe, if you're running down the beach, as some commandos were in the Channel Islands, it was that you were sort of are heading towards the shore, and there's an entire German garrison coming after you. It's quite comforting that in the bay there is something which A will do 50 knots and B has some twin 88 Oerlikons that are going to discourage your pursuers from going much further. And this is also, I think, two of the really critical things about it. They make the Royal Navy look bigger. These little craft were mass produced. They were absolutely sort of chucked in the water, sort of with the build quality of Billy bookcases. But you could stand up in Parliament in the days when you didn't just lie in Parliament, I suppose, but you could stand up and say the British Navy has 3,000 ships, and it didn't really matter that actually 1,500 of those ships were tiny little craft. There was a huge psychological advantage to this, and it's not just the British Navy, because of course you have to remember that Britain was also hosting the Free French Navy, the Free Polish Navy, and they were able to get their own motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, and launches, and sort of have a navy without the sort of British having to sort of give away sort of big capital ships. And it gave them the sort of independence and dignity of having those. There is this great story of the Polish Navy being given one of their jobs. So they're stationed in Harwich, and they were going out during the Battle of Britain. One of their jobs was to kind of, as planes ditched in the sea, to rescue the crews. And then it turned out that all the Axis forces crews that they brought back were dead, often with very fresh gun wounds in them. And it was kind of like, that guy was definitely swimming towards your boat. Yeah, he died. Yeah, he's got like 3 bullet holes in him. Yeah, he was quite a good swimmer. It's like, okay, you just don't get that job anymore. Anyway, and one final thing really is these things just look awesome. I mean, newsreels were absolutely full of these things. They were known as the mile a minute men, because they couldn't quite do 60 knots, but it's kind of and they were called the Spitfires of the Sea, was the sort of name that went around. And it's kind of one of those things that Al Murray pub landlord, you sort of come out of Spitfires of the Sea. It's these things are incredible. They look like this. What's not to like about something that looks like this? They look like this. It's pretty awesome. It's so cool. They look like this. Wow. So these things may, and this is not to be sneezed at, right? This is, war is, sort of perception is reality. And, these things had an incredibly important job to do, partly just kind of, sort of photographs of steely-eyed commanders looking out over the Channel and the North Sea, defending the island is incredibly powerful. We need to talk about the cons, though. So these things are as bulletproof as lingerie. They are made out of wood, just sort of a couple of layers of wood and some calico. They don't even slow bullets down. Terrifying. They can't operate in above a force 4. Hey, they're operating in the Channel and the North Sea. When is it ever a force 4, right? So they are about sensitive to the weather as divers. And this was a massive failure during the Channel Dash. So there's two German pocket battleships. The British knew that they had to get back into the Baltic, and they were kind of waiting for them. They had all the bombers stood down during the day and stood up at night. The idea being that only an idiot would actually try a stunt like this in broad daylight. Of course, the Germans decided to do it at dawn, and by the time the British could react, they were already at Dover, and all the British could muster was a bunch of biplanes and some motor torpedo boats. And this was one of these sort of actions where the lots of Victoria Crosses are awarded posthumously. It was just the most potent demonstration of what happens if you try and attack, an absolutely state-of-the-art technology with sort of stuff that's, sort of from another era, really. So they're very, very vulnerable to air attack, which means that they weren't much use during the day. You pretty much had to use them at night. So, you know, a nice moonlit night in winter where the nights are long and the sea is completely calm is your perfect conditions for a motor torpedo boat. Oh, by the way, you're stationed in the North Sea. Good luck. And unfortunately, they're very uncomfortable. And I've got a little quote from a sailor here who experienced them, a guy called Thomas O'Leary, who said, "In harbour lovely, at sea terrible. It's indescribable. I thought I'd never get used to it. When we started at Falmouth, our patrols used to be down to the Scilly Isles. Once you passed Land's End, it could get awful, sick, sick, sick. When you get back, you'd say, I'm getting off these. You'd think it was someone with an enormous sledgehammer hitting you underneath, and you'd think the boat was going to fall to pieces." Yeah, it doesn't sound like fun. They're also, as I mentioned earlier, these things are floating bombs. So there was a disaster at Ostend where the Canadian Navy, again, you know, sort of given a load of motor torpedo boats. After D-Day, they went into Ostend to be serviced. There were 6 of them rafted up together, and they just blew up. You know, sort of just spontaneously combusted, blew every window out in the whole of Ostend, and killed 30 Canadian sailors. Was already mentioned Saint-Nazaire, and also in Portland Harbour, 2 American PT boats just blew up. You know, no enemy action, nothing. Just you know, you've got fumes from an aero engine, and you know, who knows? Who knows why in history you know, these boats showed up? It's just one of those mysteries lost in time. Anyway, here's a load of jolly matelots enjoying cigarettes on top of a boat which is fueled by aero fuel. What could possibly go wrong? Let's go diving. Okay. This is you know, you thought you were never going to see a picture of green stuff with rust, right? We've got this far into a BSAC lecture before before one appeared. Let's just talk a little bit about what you might see on a motor torpedo boat. So these things, yeah, as I say, you know, not only bulletproof as Anne Summers lingerie, but they also have the structural integrity of aspirin. So you've got these layers of mahogany, sometimes 3, sometimes 2, and they're at right angles to each other. So if you imagine, if I, so yes, you've got mahogany laid diagonally this way. Underneath that, there's a layer of treated calico between it, and there's another sort of layer of mahogany going that way on top. You've then got, you know, very light, very stiff birch frames. These things are not built to last. You know, they like I say, they're kind of IKEA, you know, sort of pretty slotted together boats that are built to be, you know, sort of, they're mass produced. They're being built by license by pretty much every boatyard in the UK is kind of throwing these things into the water. You know, they do not have the kind of build quality of something that is going to last for 80 years in the water. So, but you know, what you will see is little traces of this, you know, sort of down. You will, you know, still see bits of the sort of purple treated cloth. So more eagle cutaways, because eagle cutaways are amazing, right? So the sort of stuff that you know, is going to survive on these is going to be things like, I'll talk a bit more about this, but you've got the heads here, you know, sort of porcelain, some name for the Royal Navy porcelain toilets of World War II. I'm trying to, it's not Brown Bess, but it's kind of something like that. You may get armament. So there's a thing on this is quite a late one. This is a dark class, but often here you'll get an Oerlikon 88 single or double, and the sort of turntable was known as a bandstand, mainly wood. There you've often got, there's the officer's heads up here, and the engine, that's a Deltic engine back here. And I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of bridge and the stuff that you may find remains on there, and armaments on stern if you've got them, also, you know, sort of mines, and of course torpedo tubes potentially, although obviously being non-ferrous metal, they do tend to get spidged early on. So let's talk about Packard engines, because almost all of these things have Packard engines, and if you are going to, dive on one of these, this is almost certainly the sort of thing you're going to see. And it's also, just as I say, there's a lot of these in the water. So, just if you're on a drift dive, you're coming across something that looks like this, it's handy to be able to sort of recognize it for what it is. The one actually that we've been looking at in Portland is marked on wrecksite as a trawler. But you kind of think this is a trawler with 3 aero engines, V12 aero engines on it. That's quite a punchy trawler. What you can see, I think, if you look at this thing underwater, is one of the most important things about Packards is that they can go into the boat either way around. So what you tend to talk about, rather than a sort of forward end and a stern end, is a supercharger end and the gearbox end. So you can see here, this one doesn't have the gearbox on it, but it's got this. This is the air intake for the supercharger here. I'll show you what that looks like underwater. You've got the sort of very sort of supercharger and the sort of pipes coming in and out here. You've got the camshaft. So I think I've actually got. So the camshaft here is under a cover here, and the wreck, the cover's gone. That's your camshaft there. Whoops. That's it going along. That's the little rockers underneath that are controlling the cylinders, suck bank below. It's almost Valentine's Day, just remembered. Here you've got the exhaust manifold. Actually, I've got that labeled. So and the thing about the exhaust manifolds as well is you can put the exhaust on either end. Again, this is it's a super flexible engine. There's lots of different configurations it can go in, and knowing which end is which way it's facing, if it's facing, is the supercharger forward or is the supercharger facing to the stern, is a massive clue as to what you are looking at. Similarly, which end of the exhaust pipes plugged into is also a massive clue as to sort of just narrowing it down as to what kind of a class it is. If we look at this is the Packard engine from the gearbox end. So the gearbox is varied from craft to craft. So Vosper's had V-Power gearboxes made by Vosper. This one is American one. It's got a little maker's plate on it. I'll have a close-up of that somewhere. But they were made brilliantly by a company in Michigan called Joe's Gears. That was also owned by Packard. There's a little sort of aside, which is one of these little nerdy things, is that when people go Al Murray, Spitfires of the sea, the usual thing you get is kind of they all have Merlin engines in them. There was no most torpedo boats had Merlin engines. Peter Duquesne designed them with Merlin engines in mind, and the RAF told him to get on his bike. He wasn't getting Merlin engines, so which is why they had American Packard engines built into them. Packard later made Merlins under license, but for US aircraft, not for motorboats. So I just want to lay that one to rest. Yeah, so this is again just to see what the supercharger looks like underwater. Again, here's that very distinctive air intake. It did actually originally come with a little sort of canvas cover on it, which may or may not exist still. You've got also just about here, there's a maker's plate, but I think in the case of Packard's was aluminium, so that's almost certainly anodized away, but probably worth a little scrub. If you've got a little brush or something, take a look at that. Actually the manuals for these things are all available online. If you really want to nerd out, let me know, and I can send you one. Yeah, so as I was saying, it's one of the really cool ways of identifying what you're looking at is assuming that it's landed in such a way that the engines are still sort of coherently, roughly in the position that they were in when it sank, which is, you've got a pretty good chance of that. Is you can see here, so you've got, this is actually a CT, which has but there's just two Packards. You've got the superchargers at the blunt end and the gearboxes at the front. Sometimes again you've got independent gearboxes. Sometimes you've got they all go into a sort of central one depending on how the propeller's working. So this is an Elko 80, so US one. Again, you've got two superchargers facing backwards and one facing forwards in that kind of V configuration of sort of 2-1. Here they flip the engines around on the Vosper, one at the back, two at the front. So you can see supercharger, supercharger, supercharger. And the other thing you've got here is V8. So these auxiliary engines could be used both as a sort of quieter way of driving the boat, but also as a generator and stuff like that. And gay classes, 3 gearboxes are actually all at the forward bulkhead. Exhausts. So again, as I said, you've got Elkos. All the exhausts lead to the stern. They have these kind of, I'll show you in a minute, 3 quite nice little there were 6 exhaust sort of ports at the stern. And again, you've got Vosper with the forward exhaust there. So again, sort of working out where those pipes are. Again, this one is looking like you've got them coming out forwards here. That's the supercharger, and that's the towards the sharp end of the boat. Yeah, so nameplates, again, I've sort of mentioned those. Transom flaps, again, kind of a thing that survives. So gay class have these transom flaps. They're kind of a bodge on the back. They've also got a ladder. I don't know if you can see it in that picture, but there's a little ladder up the back, which seemed like a kind of design flaw that the others don't have, but hey, that's so again, just finding some of those little distinguishing things which may well have survived. Oh look, there's a picture of a diver. I think it's the only picture of the diver in the whole thing. So these are this is the Elko. You can see here you've got the exhausts coming out the back. You saw them feeding in from the inside, whereas things like gay class, 2 exhausts, Vospers, single ones. And again, if you can do a decent bit of surveying, actually understanding just that length, where those exhaust pipes are and exactly how long they are forward and back, again, is a sort of, will really help you to narrow down what it is you're looking at. Where's the bog? Again, we found the heads, and as anybody knows, in any dive boat, find that out pretty quickly. Again, the layout of the heads and the sink, which are kind of fantastic things that kind of will often survive, will give you big clues as to what you're looking at. Similarly, fuel tanks are kind of quite thin, may well degrade, but you might well find some of the structural stuff around them. The big thing here is Elkos had no fuel tank at the stern. They had a little workshop in there instead. So what the fuel tank looks like on a Vosper. Deltics are these kind of monsters. If you find a Deltic, it's rather than having a V shape, you've got cylinders going this way, and this way in a delta shape. If you are curious as to how that works, it works like this, which is just completely mind-blowing and brilliant. Why don't all engines look like this? I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but yeah, very cool if you find one of these. That's a pretty awesome chunk of metal. And if you're a train spotter, doubly so. Bonus engine. So just off Bincleaves, which is south of Portland Harbour, the sort of southernmost breakwater, there was an early Thornycroft prototype, which had this really cool single torpedo tube on it that was rotating like that. And apparently it was hulked and for years just sat in the harbour in Portland until the old harbour master just told somebody to take it out and sink it. So apparently it is somewhere off Bincleaves. And the thing about this is it has a W18 engine made by Lorraine. It's called a Lorraine Orion. It's a sort of interwar aero engine. None of these are known to be in existence. So there is one somewhere off Bincleaves. If you fancy a bit of a bimble round that southern breakwater, it's there somewhere. Bridge layouts, just kind of like if you're finding bits of stuff, They start really simple, and they end up really complicated. They just get a lot more kit on them as the war and technology progresses. So I kind of hope that I've kind of lit a fuse under some of you to go and sort of explore and find some motor torpedo boats, and to sort of maybe try and identify some ones that are kicking around. Just to kind of help you get started or to think about stuff. MTB 16 is these are just off wrecksite, so just some of the ones that are also listed there. It's one off Goodwin Sands. Sorry to those of you who are anybody's listening in Scotland and stuff like that. They do tend to be in the Channel and around Dover, stuff like that. Off St Margaret's, which is just slightly north of Dover. You've got MTB 218. In the eastern approaches to the Solent, there is an unknown German torpedo boat listed just here. Also, the brilliantly named HMS Hazard. It's like the Navy. You've got to love them. We've also got there's two German torpedo boats that are being dived. Again, those of you who know Maverick diving in Dover, Chris is doing some dives on. These are bigger. They're kind of like the ones that Admiral Scheer had at Jutland. So sort of somewhere between a torpedo and a destroyer. So he's diving those in June, if you fancy it. And yeah, there's another German E-boat off Beachy Head, which is actually our stamping ground, and I hope we can get out on a rib to go and look at that later in the year. And then there's HMS Bloodhound, which is somewhere HMS Bloodhound is somewhere off Bincleaves. So Bincleaves just down here in Portland. And then just these are also the ones that we have been looking at, or sort of candidates around Portland. So MGB 90 and 92 were the ones that were destroyed by fire in Portland. We don't know what happened to them. If the thing that we were diving was one of them, it could be. Gay Fencer was used as target practice. It went from being a motor torpedo boat. Eventually, I think it was an Admiral's launch, and then eventually got used as a target. Then, if you fancy going further afield, Suda Bay in Crete has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 motor torpedo boats were sunk there. The German invasion of Crete, the absolutely savage fighting there. There is a major ferry terminal there too, so at your own risk. Again, Hong Kong, there is also a lot of torpedo boats were sunk defending Hong Kong, if you fancy that. And a bit of further reading. So I can thoroughly recommend for identifying motor torpedo boats, Allied Coastal Forces of World War II. There's one on Fair Miles and one on motor torpedo boats, which are have just all the schematics you could possibly want. Coastal Forces at War is another one which has incredible detail on these things. I would also hugely recommend Nicholas the movie The Ship That Died of Shame, which was actually filmed in Weymouth on a Gay class motor torpedo boat, and it has Dickie Attenborough and a whole host of British lovies, and is actually a really brilliant film based on Nicholas Montserrat's very evocative short story about these guys who during the war are a motor torpedo boat crew who get a motor torpedo boat and start smuggling in it. And that's actually what happened. So a lot of motor torpedo boats were sold off after the war, which is kind of why it's a bit sort of, there's a lot of dead ends about where some of these things ended up. But quite a lot of them were bought by smugglers, because if you're smuggling, what's better than a boat that does 55 knots in an age when nobody else can actually touch you in these things? So there's various ones were impounded around the Mediterranean, especially by the Spanish government, cigarette runners and stuff like that. So this is BSAC. So we have to have a what have we learned today slide. Victorian laissez-faire capitalism was hog wild. Just design boats, give them to your enemies, and then build a boat to solve the problem you created. Motor torpedo boats are really cool as long as you're not actually in one. Smoking is bad for you. And small wrecks have big stories. There's a lot to see and a lot to learn, and they are completely they can be as fascinating as some as the Britannic. The stories are as evocative, and there's a lot of them out there. But yeah, by 1946 there were over 2,000 vessels in coastal forces, and we don't know where most of them are. So there's a lot still out there to be discovered. Thank you.